Hello, everyone, and welcome to From Our Perspective to Therapist Moms in a Microphone. I'm Claudia Glassman.
And I'm Katie Truax.
And we are going to continue our conversation today about anxiety. Yes, we scratched the surface last episode in regards to the anxiety we feel when we become a parent. And I think today we're going to talk a little bit more globally about anxiety, how it manifests, what it looks like, and what we can do about it. Mm-hmm. So Katie, did you have any thoughts on anxiety to start us off?
Yeah. So let me see if I can remember. I always say I'm going to write this stuff down so I can say it the same way every time. And I yet to do that because I'm not that conscientious. But so how do we define kind of when we talked about what anxiety was last time, right? We kind of talked about it as the brain perceiving something in our environment that could be a threat, whether it's emotional, physiological, psychological, financial, relational. And sometimes the brain is correct in that, right? Which is where we kind of call that an appropriate anxiety response. And then sometimes the brain gets it a little bit wrong and we have a reaction to something either that's happening that's not really threatening, or something that's not happening that's a story that we create in our minds about something in the future that could happen, right? Like an imagination. And then the brain has what we call the stress response in light of those two stimuli, right? And so we usually call that a misappropriated stress response or misappropriated anxiety because it's not something that's actually threatening. So the brain kind of mounts defenses to something that isn't actually there, or is there but isn't problematic, right? So that's kind of like maybe just a reminder of a foundation of what anxiety is. And then we can go into maybe more detail about what that stress response cycle is, what happens in the body when, the brain initiates this domino effect of events, and how we can know what's happening in those moments and how we can kind of work backwards from detecting those physiological cues to tell us what might be happening in our brain. Does that sound like a good thing?
That does. And, a reminder, we talked about this last time, but for those that, may not have heard our first podcast and are just jumping in now, I like to highlight that anxiety serves a function, right? Which you touched on in terms of, if there's an actual threat or danger, there's a function to our anxiety. And I think we have become a very anti-anxiety culture. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we overlook its function, right? Sometimes we overlook the fact that even if I am feeling anxious about something, that is a feeling that might be relaying a signal to me, right? Like it's trying to tell me something. And sometimes instead of squashing it, if we could question, right? Like, what's it trying to tell me? What's it trying to communicate? Why am I feeling this? And if we approach it with a little bit of curiosity, we may get some answers of how to resolve it, instead of trying to quickly make it go away. Which I think it's uncomfortable. So we like to do that.
I love that. And then I think sometimes we get ourselves into trouble when we try to make it go away without doing that questioning or without knowing more about what's happening and why, and then using, the appropriate skills to help it go away. Because if we try to get it to go away and then we don't do it well, then sometimes we have more anxiety in response to not being able to get it to go away. Right. Yeah. So it kind of begins this nasty positive feedback loop.
That's right. And then we're anxious about our anxiety.
Yeah.
Which is, the nasty cycle of anxiety. Right. Yeah. And so then it becomes layered, and now we're anxious about anxiety, and then that feeds the anxiety, and all of a sudden we're in a cycle that we feel like we can't get off of or get out of. Yeah.
That's right. And so I think that's anxiety is one of those topics, anxiety and trauma, and the two are very close related cousins. But where I like to, whenever I work with clients, start first with kind of understanding. And then once I understand, I provide a lot of what we call as therapists as psychoeducation, which is just like teaching the client about their own experience. So we can teach you guys a little bit about that today, just from a general perspective, because with all of this, as you'll hear as we talk more and more, knowledge truly is power, right? And when we have the knowledge that we need about what's happening in our bodies and in our brains, sometimes that is, like to Claudia, to your point, like that curiosity, when we can find some of those answers, sometimes that is the antidote to the anxiety in and of itself.
That's right.
Okay, so where should we start?
Whoa. So let's start a little bit with that psychoeducation, because I think when we understand something a little more fully, even if we can't influence and change it right in that moment, at least there's some understanding of what's happening. And I think when anxiety is just this overwhelming feeling we have, and we have this panic and we just don't know where it's coming from, it's harder to manage, right? So let's start with that psychoeducation piece.
Yeah.
And, I said this to you offline and I'll say it now, anxiety is a huge topic. I mean, I think we could do, 101 episodes and break it down into, a lot of pieces. So I'd really love to give people just kind of places to start, things they can do. And, we're going to try to take a very holistic approach to this. So as we kind of go through the psychoeducation piece, hopefully you guys get nuggets of things that you may not have thought of before in terms of how it impacts anxiety.
Yeah. And as you're listening, I mean, eventually, like, we have nine listeners so far, right?
Woo!
Big time.
9.
As yes. Like that grows, right? And as people, find us on social media, feel free to, write in and make comments on our post about what you might want to hear from, or if you have questions, like, we love to take those and kind of use them to shape what we talk about so that it's most helpful for y'all. So, okay, so I feel like the physiology of, or the stress response cycle, that's going to be something where, kind of like last time we said, the two of us might have different ways of explaining this, and different things that we highlight with clients. But I'll start, and then Claudia, you can kind of tag on whatever I forget, or if you want to tweak anything based on your understanding, totally feel free. So okay. The way I usually explain this to people is that, we have three main parts of the brain that are involved in this process, right? So we have the brain stem, which is, what we call the reptilian brain. That's the part of the brain that keeps our body alive without us having to think about it. So things like heart rate, body temperature, blood pressure, and respiration happen in the brainstem. And then right in the smack dab middle of the brain, we have something called the limbic system, what we also call the animal brain. This is where we have the seat of our emotions, the seat of our memory, the seat of fight, flight, or freeze. And this is where the stress response becomes initiated. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, or the neocortex, which is the kind of forebrain. That's what makes us uniquely human, that we use to plan, reason, be rational and logical, create. And what happens, well, let me say one other piece first. The primary function of the brain and the body is to stay alive. And so above everything else that we're doing all day, every day, there's parts of the brain that are in charge of nothing more than scanning our environment. And that's internal environment and external environment. And when I say internal environment, it means things like thoughts, memories, dreams, for cues that represent threats to the body. When a cue is perceived to be present, that limbic system, the animal brain, completely takes over and does two things. The very first thing it does is it shuts off that prefrontal cortex. So that's why sometimes, if you guys can ever think of being in an emotional state, particularly like a negative emotional state, you don't think clearly, right? You're like, man, I'm not logical, right? I'm not rational. I'm irrational. That's because the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, says, okay, prefrontal cortex, we don't have time for planning. We have to use all of our resources for survival, for fighting, fleeing, or freezing right now. So it kind of turns the lights off on that part of the brain. The next thing it does is it activates that brainstem and says, okay, let's go. And so things happen, like the body temperature increases. All right, you guys, if you're listening along and you're in a safe place, it's a quiet place, this might be something interesting to write down, because this is going to be powerful for you to remember if you're somebody who struggles with anxiety. So the heart rate increases, respiration gets more shallow, the body temperature increases, right? And that all happens in that brain stem. From there, a series of physiological events in the rest of the body take place as well via something called the HPA axis. The HPA stands for hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So this is where the brain kind of reaches down and begins to activate the hormonal system in the body as well. And then additional physiological things start to happen to again prepare the body for fighting, fleeing, or freezing. This includes things like our pupils dilate. We have a surge of acetylcholine and norepinephrine that rushes to our extremities. This could be where people pick up things like sweaty palms or shaky hands or feet. Again, the respiration is shallower, so we might have a difficulty getting a full breath. We feel an increase in body temperature. Sometimes that results in kind of starting to sweat, or again, sweaty palms, clammy hands, so to speak. I feel like there's one other thing I was going to forget, but maybe Claudia, you'll catch it. The body also decides to stop all non-essential functions in those moments too, again, to preserve all energy for fighting, fleeing, or freezing. So the two things that the body decides are not essential in those moments are digestion. So if you've ever heard people say, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous, like I can't get out of the bathroom, that's because the digestive system has been told to empty in order to reserve any resources, right? Energetic resources for fighting, fleeing, or freezing, and reproductive functioning. So if people are under chronic stress, we see things like disruptions with menstruation, disruptions with fertility, and so forth, so on. If you've ever had been pregnant or had friends who are pregnant, you know that people are told like, ooh, minimize your stress level, right, for the sake of the baby. And, you know, if it's an acute stressor, we can even have acute disruptions to things like menstruation and fertility as well. Oh, I know the thing that I forgot. So in addition to acetylcholine and norepinephrine rushing to the extremities, we also have a rush of blood to the extremities too. So, you know, when people come in and they say they have anxiety, I say, well, tell me what happens for you in your body, right? And that's when they start listing off, oh, my tummy gets trembly, or my chest feels tight or heavy, like there's an elephant on it. Sometimes I feel like I can't get a full breath, right? My palms get sweaty and clammy. All of this is part of that stress response cycle that I just described, as the body mounting all of its defenses to prepare to run, freeze, or fight off a stressor. Yeah. What else you got, Claude? What did I forget?
Yes, no, I love that description.
I've said it.
And now I'm going to take, so you kind of talked about when you experience a threat, what your body does.
Yeah.
And so where anxiety gets very complicated is because there's that, right, on the level of I experience a threat, this is my body's response. And sometimes our bodies have responses that feel like what you just described, that are caused by other things.
Yes.
Right. So this is where it gets complicated because hormonal imbalances, right? If you have adrenals that are not functioning optimally, right, your adrenal system's off, you may start to feel anxiety symptoms that are not caused by an actual perceived threat, right? But rather from this system within us that is imbalanced in that moment, causing these sensations, right? Too much caffeine, lack of sleep, right? All of these things can cause us to feel the same sensations in our body that mimics that response, right? So that you would have if you had an actual threat. So it gets a little complicated because it's figuring out, am I responding to this because of a perceived threat or a real threat? Or am I responding like this because of, I'm going to call it like a lifestyle challenge, right? Or some kind of hormonal imbalance. Yeah. And this is where I find the treatment of anxiety, very interesting, and really having to deep dive with my clients of what are your lifestyles, right? Are you getting sleep? Are you eating, healthy, or are you loading up on sugars that's causing these like crashes? Are you skipping meals, which might be causing low blood sugar, right? And then these kind of symptoms as well. So it's kind of this top down approach and bottom up, and then meeting in the middle to kind of figure it out.
That's right.
So yeah, that's, I think, helping clients sort that out as well. And to make it even more complex, I suppose, is you may be experiencing both, right? Sometimes it's, I had like 14 cups of coffee and I'm jittery and I feel anxious. And sometimes it's a known trigger to that anxiety, right? Well, I'm feeling anxious because I'm concerned about this, or this specific event happened that's, created more anxiety for me, or kind of sparked my anxiety. And so you really kind of teasing out for yourself and, us, for our clients, of what's contributing. The lifestyle choices that may contribute are a little bit of an easier fix, right? Because it's like, well, okay, if I know that drinking a lot of coffee kind of gets me to this anxious state, then clearly decreasing it, although I guess maybe giving up coffee is hard, but decreasing it at least, right, should reduce that. Yeah. Yeah. And so teasing out those two sources.
That's right. I love that. I've had a client start here recently within the past month who brought all of this that we're talking about today kind of to light. It might be interesting to kind of share a little bit, very anonymously, about some of what she brought to the table when she started. Do you think that would be fun for people to hear about?
All 9 listeners say go for it.
Yeah. 1,000 one day. Okay. So essentially, this gal came in because she had been experiencing increased heart rate and increased blood pressure, to the extent that she was concerned. And she'd been to several different types of physicians, right? Both medical doctors and functional wellness doctors. And among all of them, the feedback she was getting was that it was just her anxiety. And somebody once told her she was a hypochondriac, which, if you guys aren't familiar with that, basically the definition of somebody who is a hypochondriac, right, is somebody who perceives they have medical problems when they in fact do not. And to an extent that it's distressing and kind of problematic and creates, disturbances in their lifestyle. So we started talking, right? And of course, I'm digging deeper and getting lots of examples and asking lots of questions, getting lots of answers. Well, it turns out that she has recorded some very high blood pressures from time to time. And, both in the doctor setting and at home, she has a kind of a home test, right? And so we began down this route of talking about exactly what you're talking about. And first I said, I'm going to disagree with whoever told you that you are a hypochondriac, right? Because you have objective evidence to show that, yes, you do indeed measure, and it was high, right? And I'm not talking like slightly elevated. It was significantly high when she told me the numbers of her blood pressure. So you're not a hypochondriac. These things are actually happening, right? Your body's actually having some symptomology. So when you feel like you have high blood pressure, you take your blood pressure using a blood pressure cuff and it registers that you have high blood pressure. That rules out hypochondriasis. So first of all, that was relieving, right? Because the frustration of slew of medical professionals saying, oh, it's all anxiety, right? And what she heard from that was, it's all in your head.
Yes.
Right. And so they wanted to prescribe her anti-anxiety medication. So what we began talking about was, well, it could be all anxiety, and that doesn't mean it's all in your head. So we started with the psychoeducation that we've talked about, today and last episode, around what is anxiety, what is the stress response. And so putting her symptoms in that context for her, right? And so allowing for her to see, sometimes when I feel these things, right, it's objectively because my blood pressure is elevated. Now, is my blood pressure elevated because of an underlying health issue? We don't know, right? Is my blood pressure elevated because of a thought process? Sometimes, right? And we've begun teasing that out. She's very clear about one thing that makes her very afraid when she thinks about it. And whenever she thinks about that thing that makes her afraid, the body mounts this stress response cycle, right? Where the heart rate increases, the blood pressure increases, the body temperature increases. She has difficulty getting a full breath, chain reaction, right? And then if she takes her blood pressure and it's high, she gets more afraid. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So one of the things we're working on next is teasing out, okay, A, to your point, are there any underlying health issues that need to be addressed? And B, if not, and well, either way, really, teaching her skills to kind of like manually override the system where even when her blood pressure's high, she has this empowered feeling that because she knows ways to shift out of that fight or flight response into the rest or digest state, which is out of sympathetic mode into parasympathetic mode, and then calm the body down, just kind of soothing everything. And when that happens, we can very often, again, barring any major medical issues, which most of her or all of her physicians have ruled out thus far, we can manually kind of turn the dial down on things like blood pressure and heart rate and body temperature.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I've seen a lot of people that have come to me because it's, some kind of digestive issue is also another really popular one where it's like, it's your anxiety and I can't help you, says the doctor, right? Go see a therapist. And then we get the phone call. I have a couple of thoughts on that. I don't always know if all of my clients have been thoroughly assessed or accurately assessed. I think digestion's super complicated. It could be food allergies. There's a lot of things, right? But I do know people that have said to me, I don't always know if I'm anxious or if it's discomfort in my stomach that I then have to explain because my doctor said I don't know what it is. And so now in my head, I'm like, I must be anxious, right? And so sometimes our brains fill in the gaps.
That's right.
So it doesn't know what the reason is, right? And if it's, I feel discomfort in my stomach. Well, I don't know what that's about. So it must be my anxiety. And that's not always the case. And so I do always really recommend people, thoroughly get checked out to make sure it's not a physical reason why they're experiencing this, and then they've just maybe filled in the gap to try to explain what this sensation is. So it is bi-directional, which again, Katie, to your point, it's like it becomes a lot of work kind of teasing that out. The benefit is that the brain is incredibly powerful, and so we can tweak our physiology using strategies and techniques, right? And even thoughts sometimes, right? There's mantras work for a reason, right? And so because it's bi-directional, we can also influence it bi-directionally.
Absolutely.
Which is very cool. Yeah. So
I was about to ask them a question. They can't answer us.
They can't answer us. They don't. 9 listeners cannot answer.
Can you explain what you mean when you say bi-directionally?
Sure. That our physiology can affect our, I'm going to say emotions. And in this sense, I'm going to, lump anxiety into an emotion, and our emotions can affect our physiology. Right. So we can have physical reactions to our emotions, and we can have emotional reactions to our physical states and physical reactions. The idea between like I become hangry, right? When I'm hungry, my mood is directly impacted by my lack of food or my low blood sugar, right? It's not me making that up. It's not me imagining it. It's not all in my head. It is like literally I'm a cranky person when I don't eat, right? And so in the same way that my mood can be impacted by something that's just a physical need, my need to eat, I can also then, my body can be impacted by my thought, right? I perceive this threat, or I'm thinking about a possible horrible outcome in the future. And now my entire body is having that response that you described earlier, where I'm sweating, my heart's beating fast, adrenaline's starting to pump, right? And I'm stuck in this state because of a thought I had. And so that's what I mean by bi-directional, that it can be physical and or emotional and influencing one another.
Right. And so then we can therefore intervene, right, to stop or alleviate this, either on a physiological level or on a emotional level, right? So like maybe the easiest example is, and the first skill that I teach folks when I teach them coping skills for things like this would be working with the breath. And, I remember when I was doing a lot of my early training and trauma work, what I learned was, when this stress response cycle starts and that respiration gets shallow because the limbic system tells that cerebellum, go, 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 time to go, then the brain stops getting enough oxygen. When the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, it kind of perceives that we're like drowning. And so then that's more trouble, right? So let's imagine that you might be like walking around outside and it's a hot day, or you have maybe, let's say it's allergy season, and you're having some shallow or some challenges with respiration because of that, right? Or you're kind of still getting into your workout, right? And you feel a little short of breath. Well, that might be just a purely normal physiological response to things like, increasing your heart rate because of exercise or allergens in the environment or heat in the environment, right? Maybe you have a touch of asthma. Who knows? This activated certain times a year and you feel it more times than other times. And then what could happen is the brain says, ooh, I'm not getting enough oxygen. This is a problem. And then the rest of that stress response cycle starts. So that's an example of how we can pick up on a physiological cue that has nothing to do with anxiety, right? Like Claudia, you mentioned, like digestion's another kind of question mark there. And then the brain tells a story, I'm in trouble, when we're really not in trouble. And so the way we can manually override that is by kind of insisting that we get enough oxygen to the brain. So we teach clients techniques to make sure they're breathing in such a way that allows them to get enough oxygen. And then the brain has to kind of calm down, right? The brain cannot be in sympathetic mode and parasympathetic mode at the same time. And so if we can force it into parasympathetic mode, which is that rest and digest state, then the sympathetic mode kind of like chills out a little bit. So when we force the body to get enough oxygen, the brain says, oh, wait, hold on, maybe I'm not in trouble after all, right? And then we compare it with the thought kind of sequence as well about understanding, oh, you know what? I'm just having this shortness of breath right now because I'm exercising hard, right? That's self-awareness. Or, oh, you know what? I'm just having this shortness of breath right now because it's April and I get a little bit of asthma every time it's April in Florida.
That's right. Yeah. And really kind of, again, what you're describing right there is this concept of like, what's my anxiety telling me, right? In this case, it's physiological, right? It's your asthma, it's your allergies. Maybe it's, I need more sleep, I should lay off the coffee. Maybe it's, I'm really concerned about this deadline. There's things I can do to get ahead of that. And right, our anxiety is sending us messages. And so it's helpful to pay attention to it. And, we kind of talked about in the beginning of, yes, I think managing it, right? Understanding it, having influence over it and control over it versus our goal to eliminate it, because that's not functional. Like we need anxiety to stay alive, or we would, be reckless and putting ourselves in danger left and right. So I'm with you. I think my first line of defense is always returning to the breath too. I like it because it's easy. People can do it in a discreet way. You can be in a public place and just center yourself on your breath, right? Take those deep breaths. It doesn't have to be this big grand gesture. And so it is a skill. We all need to breathe. And I think there are, I don't know what your go-to breathing exercises are. I work a lot with kids, so mine look different sometimes. But for adults, I talk a lot about proper breathing. We all tend to breathe shallow and through our chest and not into our abdomen, and really kind of do these, what I call with the kids, the belly breathing. And so one of the things I really do is I teach people how to breathe, which sounds so silly, but if you watch a baby breathe, they actually breathe correctly. They breathe this deep abdominal breath, right? And then I'm not sure what happens to us as we grow older, but we tend to breathe very shallow. So I don't know about you, but ever since I kind of started this work, I actually only do abdominal breathing. That's how I breathe now. But to really focus on, having people put their hands on their stomach and inhale and really fill up the abdomen with the air instead of our chest. And sometimes I'll have people put a hand on their chest too and kind of press down so that they can ensure that they're not breathing that way. And really starting to, like, oxygenate our system and take those deep breaths. Yeah.
That's right. That's so powerful. And that's a great place to start. And the truth of the matter is, yes, it's always with you. It's also free. And it is not discreet, as you said. And in my opinion, it's so foundational. Like, I won't even teach other skills until people can master that belly breathing, because if you're not getting enough oxygen, right? Just like we just talked about, it doesn't matter any of the other skills that you could try to apply, right? They get more fancy and more nuanced as we go from breathing, but you could do anything under the sun. But as long as you're not getting enough oxygen to the brain, your body's not going to be able to shift out of that fight or flight response, no matter what else you do, whether it's thoughts, emotions, or other physiological kind of like techniques to regulate. You have to start with that breath. And you guys, there's a lot of great resources. If you were to say go to YouTube or go to let's say Spotify or iPodcast or oh gosh, even Google, right? Like, you can Google belly breathing or search on some of these other search engines for belly breathing. And I guarantee you there's 100 billion therapists out there who've done, really beautiful things to teach you how to do that. And so that's something, if you're interested in learning how to do that to help yourself after you listen to this podcast, please do that. That's something great to do either, as you're winding down for bed, waking up for the day, if you have a little quiet time between appointments or meetings or kiddo pickups and so forth and so on, to try to squeeze that in and just learn how to do that. And then, like Claudia said, remembering that that's really how we were designed to breathe. Claudia, real quick before we wrap up, I know we're running short on time, but do you remember calling me? Or I don't remember if you called or texted me, but our kids were like young and you were like, is Ellie still belly breathing? You were like, I was checking Kinsley and Ansley, and they're both, but I think you said, I can't tell about Ansley anymore, but I can tell Kinsey's still belly breathing. And we were like so relieved. And I was like, I think Ellie is too. And I don't remember how old they were, but you were like using that as like a marker of like, okay, are they still peaceful? Are they still pure? Like, has the world or us as imperfect parents like messed them up yet? Right?
That's funny. Yeah, no, that's hysterical. That's hysterical. Well, yeah. And, I think there's so many, like, the breathing is number one. I love grounding techniques. Peter Levine talks a lot about, trauma in the body, but also kind of that cycle you described before of how that anxiety cycle, right? The threat, and then the body responding to that fight or flight and freeze, and how we don't often complete that cycle. So what I talk to clients a lot about is completing that cycle. When you feel it, shake your body, shake your arms, jump up and down, right? Like, release that stuck energy of that anxiety that's pent up. When an animal is about to get, attacked by another animal, like, you'll see them physically shake it off. Mm-hmm. They shake and then they continue on with their lives, right? And we just hold it and I don't know what we do. We just take a deep breath and move on. And so, as silly as it sounds, I will have people, shake their anxiety out. Or these grounding techniques of, when you're in a moment and you can't calm it down, 3 things I see, 3 things I hear. That's really great during like panic, right? When you're feeling disconnect from your body, you're so panicked, you can't even take that deep breath, right? The breath's not coming. To really kind of rein it in with these grounding techniques of, okay, like, I see 3 things I see in front of me or around me, right? 3 things I hear. What do I smell? What do I taste? Just to bring yourself back into your body, right? And to kind of start calming that reptilian brain a little bit, so that you can then think and then use these other strategies. Because oftentimes, it's a cycle where, okay, I need to breathe, but I can't breathe, right? That's the symptom. I can't do that.
I can't. It's too hard in the moment.
Yeah. So calming the system enough to be able to take that breath.
Yep. And then going from there.
Yeah.
Love it. Should we pause here, do you think?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about okay, so last time we started with what's anxiety, right? How anxiety is related to being a parent, right? And what anxiety even means. And then today, kind of picking up from there, going more into the physiology of anxiety, and how that physiology can be initiated by thoughts, by our brain subconscious perception without a thought of something that's happening in the environment in the here and now, it's being threatening to us, or by our brain assigning a label maybe that's inappropriate to a symptom of the stress response cycle that's happening in the body, and assuming that we're having anxiety, and then building a case and building that stress response on top of that from there. And we've started talking about kind of one of our first go-tos is the breath for beginning to calm that down, and that there's other things too, that and if we can't get to the breath, trying to orient to the present, being mindful, looking around us, grounding ourselves in the here and now. And there's some more beautiful techniques, but we're going to have to pause for today because I think we're at the end of our time, and then we can pick up here with some other stuff that's super fun next week. And again, if you guys have anything you want to hear, find us on social media. Claudia is Mighty Oak Parenting. I am Rob and Katie Truax, Truax. And leave us a comment when we post this. We're on Instagram and we're on Facebook. And let us know what you want to hear from us. If there's any questions about what we've said so far, where you want to hear us go next. If there's any, like, if you're like, well, what about this, guys? We'd be happy to speak to anything like that. And it kind of makes it fun for us too. So, anything else you want to say?
No, I think we have a ton of topics on retainer that we are working way through. We kind of wanted to do another one on anxiety because it is a large topic, and it felt a little incomplete, I think, last time, because we weren't able to go into all this. But yeah, I mean, anything that is mental health related, parenting related, therapy related, I mean, I think we're willing to dive into.
So fun. Okay.
All right. Well, all 9 people out there, have a great week, and we will be back with our next episode.